Hello, America. Today is February 16th, 2016. I have been thinking about Jade Helm, and I found a video yesterday on Alex Jones. It was from April 1st, 2015, and I'll leave the link for this. This is an over 2 hour Alex Jones program. I would suggest going and looking at this. I'm going to try to put in everything that I feel that's pertinent from Oregon because there are so many correlations between what happened in Oregon, if especially if you have been keeping up and know many of the things that happened in Oregon, the correlations between the Jade Helm operation and that are to me amazing. So I found this interview and I'm going to try to edit out the parts that's not needed because it's very lengthy and they go off into different subjects. So I'm going to try to edit it the best I can. Anyway, let's listen to Steve Quayle on the Alex Jones program. Now, I'm not a big fan of either one, but the things that they say in here, I cannot help but listen to.
Steve Quayle in just a moment. We're going to talk to him about the Jade Helm exercise, what he believes is behind this. What's the purpose of it? I'm very troubled just by the scale and scope of it, by the actions that we've seen from our military. One of the things I think got a lot of people scared was this nationwide emergency alert test that happened yesterday, mainly on the East Coast. This is an article that Paul Joseph Watson had up yesterday. He said it began around 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, was broadcast in Washington, D.C., Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. It said that there was going to be an alert that would run from 11 a.m. until 12 midnight, and the message was up for about 10 minutes. At no point were the viewers advised that the alert was only a test. The question is, were they a day early on April Fools or what? I mean, what do we do with this government that is constantly doing these types of things? Are they trying to test our reaction to them? Is this a mistake? Are they just totally incompetent? Is it all of the above? I don't know. Now, he points out that, of course, last October, we had another very suspicious emergency alert from the White House, interrupted TV viewers across America and told them to stand by, tune into their phone. Now, they blamed that one. That was AT&T. They said that was some nationally syndicated radio station that sent out the alert message by mistake. Maybe that was. He says, despite the fact that only the federal government can send out EAS alerts, the alert system can only be activated by the president in times of an emergency, reported Fox 5. So this is the second time we've seen this. The last time was October, so that's, what, about 6 months? They're putting out these nationwide alerts that there's an emergency coming up, and nothing that says that it was a test. We're all familiar with that. You know, this was just a test. If it had been an actual emergency, they don't do that anymore either. Constantly keeping the American people in a state of questioning what is real and what isn't. That is part of a massive psyop, if nothing else. Let's go to Steve Quayle now. Steve was one of the original founders of the PrEP movement. He's been a talk radio host for 20 years. He was a lone voice 20 years ago saying that the Chinese and Russians would ultimately back their currencies with gold, that they would want to cash these in on something besides the petrodollar.
Now, I'd like to interrupt right there, where he says that Steve Quayle wrote about the Russians and the Chinese going off the petrodollar and onto the gold. I did a video the other day about how China bought the Chicago Stock Exchange. Now, could China be cashing in on the debt that we owe them? It's a thought. I don't know. I haven't looked into that. There is so much more to look into right now. My concern is the safety of American lives. So that's another one to think about. With the Chicago Stock Exchange being purchased by a so-called Chinese group, is that a cover for China cashing in on the debt that we owe them? Well, let's listen to some more about Jade Helm.
Joining us now is Steve Quayle. Thank you, Steve.
Well, David, good. It's really nice to be on with you because Jade Helm, I think, needs to be put in the larger context. This is the first time in history that a 2-month-long operation is going to be focusing on the American public. We know that the same tactics that are being proposed for the exercise to take place between the hours of midnight and 4 or 5 in the morning is exactly what the special operations troops did prior to the bombing of Iraq and all of our different Middle Eastern ventures, whether it's Afghanistan. In other words, you move the special operations community in prior to an event. Now, remember, I want to take everybody back to Larry Greatwall in his book, No Place to Hide. If people remember, he was the one that penetrated the weather underground when Bill Ayers and 24 other elite from Ivy League trained schools were talking about the necessity in the early 70s of killing 25 million Americans, and prior to the killing of them, moving them into detention camps for re-education. Now, I know, David, that you've read his stuff, but here's the larger context. I think that people are being tied up with the events or the implementation of how they're going to round up people and kill them, and they're forgetting the idea that when Bill Ayers was making this comment, he was deadly serious. Now, I think if people put it into context, notice the change. Notice the change when Middle East terrorists became obviously embraced by this administration. Now, that's the context. I think that people have got to understand that context, David, because what we're talking about is not an exercise. When the local police are told to stand down and not respond to gunfire, by the way, it's a live fire exercise. When we've seen massive YouTube videos, you guys at Infowars.com have led the charge in showing all the videos coming into you from all over the country. People are now starting to get it. People have got to understand that this explains everything. It explains the Chinese, it explains the Russians, it explains the North Koreans, and it explains the assault coming on the United States from Mexico. Remember when we broke the story? I think Alex had me on to talk about the Chinese troops. You guys verified it below the border.
Yes. Yes.
And then the thing that people have got to understand is that this is the plan. So when I say don't lose track of it in perspective, I want to just make one sentence and I'll give it back to you. In No Place to Hide, I call him Great Wall, maybe it's Grathwall, explains that the weathermen actually believe that they would be successful in overthrowing U.S. government, and that with the help of the Cubans, Chinese, Russians, and North Vietnamese, they would occupy America. Now remember, this is during the Vietnam War. Americans would have to be re-educated in camps, similar to what communists did in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and other countries that they had taken over. And then here's one of the most chilling revelations. I asked, well, Great Wall speaking, well, what is going to happen to those people we can't re-educate that are diehard capitalists? And the reply is they'd have to be eliminated. So, David, that's the context of what we see. The American people, as Alex has pointed out, as you've pointed out, as going on day after day, hours after hours, have become the enemy. And now, in the face of basically nuclear tension, and for the record, I used to write about nuclear weapons and their effects, and during the Cold War years, and civil defense and all that stuff. So as I look back on the perspective, we have seen the absolute taking apart of our military. Our top flag officers and generals fired any battlefield experience, and we've seen complete redirection of funds from foreign enemies to the internal enemies. And I've read on the air the letter that was sent in those days by, I believe it was either Janet Reno or Napolitano to the Russians requesting their help and the foreign troops. So you can't deny it any longer. People used to poo-poo black helicopters. They used to poo-poo Russian troops, Chinese troops.
Well, of course, I think exactly. We've had the article we put up over the weekend that Paul Joseph Watson and Alex Jones put together, listing all the many times that they have defined who their domestic enemies are. It's not just what Larry Grathwell was saying. We've been seeing this coming from the administration. We've been seeing it coming out of the military academies and other think tanks that are associated with the military. We saw it coming out of the MIAC report. When they define what their enemy is, when they come in and do things like the NDAA, and then they start having these training exercises like we saw in Fort Lauderdale, where it looks like they're actually implementing the NDAA, dragging people who are civilians down the street, taking them off in helicopters, marching them in single file with military guards on either side, putting them into white vans and driving them off. I mean, that's exactly what we would expect to see if they implement the NDAA. But of course, they told us, don't worry, we're not actually going to do that.
Now, the system that's been set to communicate with law enforcement from the Department of Homeland Security is a pretty secure system now. They can lock out individual officers from being able to hear the general alerts. They can punish or they can terminate. Now, these are really hard statements for people to understand. As a matter of fact, before we went on this show, I was contacted by a Navy SEAL overseas, and he said, Steve, I cannot believe what's happening to the country I love, and was ready to lay down my life for. May I speak? I'll give you one more interview that took place recently with a personal friend of mine, known to me, who met with various generals, retired, and what they told him was simply this, is that it is going operational. Now, this is generals. This isn't make-believe. This isn't scuttlebutt. This isn't internet rumor, okay? And the gentleman just happened to be at the top of their hit list.
But, Steve, just before we had to go to the break, you started talking about a source that you had and who thought this was going to be operational. Tell us what he said. Start that over again for people who are just tuning in.
Former Green Beret had a meeting with retired generals and high-ranking former enlisted men who were very concerned because the friend of mine that had the meeting was asked to come to the meeting because supposedly there was a Pentagon memorandum put out about some of the people in this country that they are forbidden to listen to. He happened to be one of them. Alex happened to be one of them. I happened to be one of them. Hawk happened to be one of them, and Doug Hagman happened to be one. There were two other guys that he couldn't remember their name, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, and I don't know it or I'd tell it. Here's the issue. The issue is, David, that the American people must understand that the sheer placement of the tanks, the armored personnel carriers, troops on the streets, and everything else is indicative. Now, let's talk about Jade Helm, the name. May I do that? The thing that is really critical for people to understand is that Jade Helm's name, Jade is always associated with China. It has nothing to do primarily with the Middle East. It has everything to do with the Far East. If I tell you the captain's at the helm, that means he's steering the ship. That means that he is the one who's in charge of the direction. One of the Chinese demands upon the United States government was the fact that they needed to disarm the American public. You remember that story when it came out that China absolutely demanded that the American public be disarmed?
Yeah, I remember that was kind of strange, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And there's always something behind that. It's kind of like when the UN came out and said, you need to shut down Colorado and Washington State. The federal government needs to shut that down because we have a UN drug treaty. And, of course, it was the UN that set up the schedule for the war on drugs 10 years before Nixon declared the war on drugs.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what's important is everything's in a name. Now, look, it's not lost in the financial markets that China has amassed the world's largest gold hoard, and this has everything to do with the name Jade Helm 15. Obviously, 15 can relate to the year that it's going to be implemented, as in this year. China is going to make an announcement at some point, and we're seeing it with the AIIB Bank. We're seeing it with the nations abandoning former allies. It doesn't matter if it's Australia. Doesn't matter if it's Britain. It doesn't matter who it is. Everyone's going to China because basically it's a truism, a maxism in the world that he who has the gold makes the rules. One of the things the bankers have been able to do is to transfer the gold that was in the United States. It's irrelevant if there's anything in Fort Knox. I'm here to tell you that there's nothing there. The point being is that China, with its 30,000 plus tons of gold, by the way, the World Gold Council is totally inaccurate in the country's gold holdings, just they're wrong. Russia, for instance, has right now in excess of 10 to 15,000 tons of gold. So the point is, let me make this clear, Jade Helm may be the orchestration and the introduction of the Chinese yuan or renminbi in a gold-backed or commodity-backed form. At that point, the dollar will lose value almost overnight, if not become worthless. My guess is, just quick and dirty, it goes down 50% in a matter of days and then another 30%. Well, that's not going to make anybody happy in the United States. The point being is that the riots will be generated. Now, here's something people need to do. Go to the root of the problem. You understand the fruit and how it will be implemented. In order for the communist revolution to take place, they want to engender civil war. I've been saying that. Alex has been saying that. And by the way, obviously with the Mayak report and others, when the veterans were vilified, any man or woman who has served in this country in any official capacity had to note that this man's military gets, and I've never been in the military, but that's what a lot of them call it, has changed so dramatically. And it's fascinating to me that even yesterday or the day before, I may be off a day, but the President of the United States has now declared they want to cut back the military pensions. At the same time, there's unlimited amounts of money to purchase billions of rounds of ammo, MRAPs, the police department who have been militarized. So here's what I'm saying.
When you're talking about that, Steve, I think it's very interesting that it was just last summer that the Pentagon announced that they were going to stop giving equipment to fire departments. This was something that they have been doing since the right after World War II, giving equipment to small rural fire departments because they can't afford very much, and they're the ones who have to deal with the really large fires. And so they shut that down. It stayed shut down for about a month, but there was a lot of pressure from the firemen, from congressmen and senators. They got that restarted. But that was happening at the very same time they couldn't get enough equipment quickly enough into all these small towns for law enforcement. They only wanted to give equipment to people who had the power and the authority to arrest. That was going to be what they were going to do it for, not to the fire departments. They wanted to completely shut that down.
Well, and you're correct. So the point is that, in essence, all the fire departments, any authority figures that with the power to arrest, and by the way, everybody, as you know, has been given the power to arrest now, from IRS agents to, remember when the Forest Service Rangers never wore weapons? I can tell you from watching them, I take a lot of photographs, and, in the national parks, and now you would swear that you would declare freely. You can't believe how weighted down those guys are with weapons in their car, AR-15s and shotguns.
And of course, you shouldn't worry about the fact that they got billions of rounds of hollow point bullets, which the military doesn't even use. You shouldn't even worry about that. As we got all the pushback, they would look at the small purchases for some of these organizations and say, well, that's just for target shooting. But it's $3 billion. They would take the very smallest ones and they would push back against that. But we won that fight. And I guess, Steve, the question is, we also had this fight about a year ago with them trying to start the war in Syria with a false flag sarin gas attack, trying to blame that on the appropriate parties so they could use that as a pretext for war. Do you think that because this has been exposed, has gone viral, and there's so much talk about it, do you think that they will just stand this down and it'll just be a training exercise? Not to say that they won't do this in the future, but don't you think that that the very publicity that has come there might make them to stand down on this for the time being?
That's what I'm praying for, literally, okay? And I literally am asking the prayerful, believing Christians around the world to pray against this because, again, it's kind of like when in even the Old Testament times, David, when, the idea or the plan to murder all of God's people that, was taking place, God raised up somebody, whether it was the prophet Elijah who could read the king's thoughts while he slept on his bed. I think that when at least a covert operation gets exposed, that they have to rethink. And let me share this. These guys have supercomputers calculating every single step and every single response. They have algorithms. When I broke the story about algorithms, the mathematical, if you will, structuring of specific, assassination parameters and rating people on a different scale, they have their targets already gridded out. It is my prayer, it is my concern that enough people scream about this, that enough people go to the congressman, because I posted a couple of weeks ago, do you remember the old miniseries America?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
You remember that the scene where the Russians come in under the guise of being, quote, national terrorists and kill all of Congress?
Yeah.
And the Russian is addressing? Well, isn't it interesting that, the senator from South Carolina made the statement that, Obama should have the right to basically do away with Congress. You remember that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, effectively, he has, hasn't he? I mean, he
Yes,
pretty
he
much
has.
does whatever he wishes. He's not constrained by the Constitution, by laws. He's not constrained by Congress or their threats. I mean, they're saying now, he wants to do he wants to implement the UN's climate change treaty just by executive order, and the Republicans are saying, well, all these countries need to realize that we just may undo that. They know they're not going to undo anything.
I think that the critical thing that people have to understand, you brought up Syria. Here it is in context. If people can understand this simple concept, everything, makes sense. Number one, in order for the Mahdi to come on the scene, that is obviously the Islamic savior. That is obviously the reign and rule of Muhammad on earth. There has to be a global nuclear conflagration. Are you aware of that?
No, I hadn't. I wasn't aware of that.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And please, I only ask that basically to allow you to feed back because I don't want to dominate, but I think we only got an hour. The thing is that we are now seeing the disruption of all the countries in the Middle East.
Now, Steve, as you were pointing out, I think it's very interesting to look at this enemies list that they have, and the fact that the connection that the Chinese government is starting this Asian investment bank, and that is really taking off. I mean, that's turning into an avalanche of people who are signing up for that. And of course, the Chinese are flush with cash. They're using this in a very different way than we have used the IMF fund. But even the United States is trying to get on this just so that they won't be left off. We see a massive shift from the United States, of course, to China. But that's been going on for quite some time. Everybody can see that. But it's really accelerating at this point, isn't it?
Well, it's not only accelerating, but, somebody said, what's in a name? My answer to that is everything. When any operation is chosen, there is usually a reason for the name being chosen. And that's why I believe that Jade Helm is so critical. Let me make this.
Now, they also talked about in this interview, which I edited out, the color-coded kill list and the Illuminati. And I'll leave the link. You can listen to the full interview. I think it's the second half of the show where he interviews Steve Quayle. But I have to say, hindsight is definitely 2020 here. Now, to me, I can see why Alex Jones did not report on the whole story in Oregon, that he did not leave his person to stick around there to report on it because he's part of that beast system. And I'm saying that because, take for instance, the school that was taken over by a paramilitary force, and Pete Santilli went over there and reported on it. Well, Alex Jones, his channel, went to a different school and reported a false story saying there's no one at the school. You see, the people that are in the system are not allowed to report the whole truth. They're only allowed to give half truths. So, back to Jade Helm. Now, when he talks about Jade Helm, China at the helm, it's odd that he mentions that because Ban Ki-moon is the pretty much Secretary General of the UN. Okay? And also, it makes you wonder again, is it possible that the Chinese are cashing in on the debt that we owe to them? It's a possibility. I don't want to be a fearmonger. I just see things and I put things together, and I feel like it's my duty to tell you exactly what I'm putting together here. Anyway, this is Call of Duty Goddess signing off, and as always, I've got your 6.